Today's gospel is about two people who violate the ancient quarantine protocols. First, there is the leper who, without permission, comes out of the quarantine facility where he is confined. Second, there is Jesus, who touches the man, declares him negative of the disease, and gives him the authorization to present himself to the city health officer for confirmation of the test results. Imagine what it must have been like for people 2,000 years ago to deal with bacterial and viral infections without the benefits of our modern-day medical sciences. Wala pa silang mga scientists like infectious disease specialists, virologists, bacteriologists, and molecular biologists like Father Nicanor Austriaco. And yet people knew somehow when they contracted a disease that was contagious but which they knew very little about. Back in the biblical days, they had only one generic term for a disease that manifested itself or its symptoms sa balat, on the skin. They just called any kind of skin disease a leprosy. They could not even distinguish it yet from herpes or chickenpox or a simple buni. It's all leprosy for them. Remember, this was long before the bacteria that caused the disease we now call leprosy was identified by a scientist named Dr. Gerhard Hansen. Kaya leprosy was later called Hansen's disease. People back then were no different from people today in the way they reacted exaggeratedly to a disease that they did not know very much about. They became very praning, paranoid about it. They developed the idea of quarantine. Totoo, matagal na yung idea of quarantine. From the Latin word quarantena, meaning 40 days. Because they were also aware, through simple observation, that even without medical intervention, some people eventually got cured by themselves. I-quarantine mo lang. They noted that the infection had a lifespan and that among the infected ones, there were those who became very sick and died and those who survived it and were able to recover. They also knew that much of it depended on the physical and the psychological health condition of the infected person. They were not even aware yet of the natural capacity of the human body to cope with the disease by producing what we now call antibodies. Ito yung ating immunity or immune system. Remember, we're talking here about 19 centuries before scientists invented vaccines. So back in those pre-scientific days, the most prevalent ideas were religious ideas. Siyempre, dahil hindi pa nila alam yung physical cause of the disease, they attributed it to a kind of spiritual infection or an affliction by an unclean spirit, or perhaps even a curse that visited people as a punishment for sins they may have committed. And their only way of determining whether or not they have already been forgiven of their sins was if they already showed signs of recovery from the disease. The book of Leviticus, and I suggest you read chapter 13 of the book of Leviticus, it is all there. Hindi ako nagbibiro kanina nung sabihin ko na mayroong ancient healthcare officers, and they were the priests. The priests served as the health officers of their communities. They were the ones who were given the authority to order the isolation of those infected with the disease para i-quarantine sila outside the town, meaning in the wilderness, in the caves, or in the desert, para hindi makahawa. And they also had the authority to allow those among them who have recovered already to return to the community, but only after a careful physical inspection. And they had to make an offering in the temple. Only then could they be publicly declared as clean, meaning cured or recovered already. But imagine how difficult it must have been, even for those who may have already recovered, in order to return to their families because of the stigma, or because the priests who were supposed to declare them cured or recovered were just too cautious about conducting the necessary physical inspections because takot din sila na mahawa. So, how did Jesus violate the quarantine regulations? Well, first of all, he was not a priest. He did not have the authority of a healthcare officer. He was a layman. He did not have the authority to submit the leper to a physical inspection as described by the law. And he was aware of this. He was aware that he was committing a serious violation when he dared to touch the leper. I suspect strongly that Jesus actually touched the man in order to check his body. And when he saw that the man's sores were dried up already, he said, I think it's okay for you to come out of your quarantine already. Kaya lang, to make it official, you have to go to the priest for a confirmation because he is the accredited healthcare officer. Huwag mo na lang sasabihin na sinabi ko. Nagbilin pa siya because he was aware that it was a violation. Nowadays, we are lucky that we can be given the proper laboratory test to check if we are still positive of the disease. Imagine kung nag-positive ka and then you waited in a quarantine and then later on, nagpa-swab test ka ulit and finally you are declared negative. That is always a relief for the family. Jesus did not do a swab test, but he dared to declare a patient negative. That's his violation. How could he dare to do that? By simple observation. But like I said, what he did was illegal because he touched the man himself. Only the priest could do that. And you know, when the priest touched the leper for inspection, gumagamit yan ng stick. Isang mahabang stick. And from a distance, tinataas yung kanyang damit to check on the sores. But Jesus threw away caution and touched the man. In the same version, of Mark, on the same healing story, the evangelist tells us, as a consequence, sabi ni Saint Mark, it became impossible for Jesus to enter a town openly. He remained outside in deserted places. Why? Because he touched the leper. Parang kayo, di ba? Pag na-expose ka sa isang COVID positive, bawal kang lumabas. Because baka dala-dala mo yung virus. There is so much that even doctors do not fully know yet about the mystery of the human body or about our human psyche. There is so much we have yet to discover. And part of the wonderful way in which God created us or our bodies is the fact that the body has the ability to cure itself, to do its own damage repair or disease control through the functioning of our immune system. That very often, kahit walang medical intervention, the body can recover from a disease. But the bigger enemy, very often, is not the virus itself, but our own fear, our own paranoia about it. For example, up to now, we are still in a collective state of hysteria about COVID-19. Tignan ko lang ang reaksyon mo pag mayroong umupo sa loob ng simbahan at dumikit sa'yo. Tignan ko lang ang reaksyon mo pag may lumapit at nagmano sa'yo. Tignan ko lang ang reaksyon mo pag mayroong kumare, tapos biglang gusto kang ibeso-beso. Di ba? We're traumatized. We cannot react normally to that anymore. Not all people who are cured of COVID are healed of the trauma that goes with it. We can become so afraid of touch, we might forget how much we need touch also. Jesus reminds us today that while a careless touch can indeed cause an infection, or while an abusive touch can indeed cause harm, a loving and compassionate touch has the power to effect healing.